So you think writing a gripping novel, a critically acclaimed novel on race relations would be enough for one person, but he's done that. I don't know if you've all seen the recent excellent documentary on Peyton and Eli Manning and David Cutcliffe and their special relationship. Well, he was in on that. He's been an attorney in high-profile death penalty homicide cases as well as insider trading cases on Wall Street. One of the things that journalists have to learn to do is that when the Supreme Court returns a 4-3-2 decision that's 87 pages long, read it and then go on the air and tell people what it says in about 6 sentences. He's done that plenty of times. When things come up in the news that involve legal processors or legal process issues, he's called on to do that. He's anchored a lot of shows. He's created a lot of programming, including court-related programming, educational programming, and he serves in high-profile capacities for everything from the Susan G. Komen Breast Cancer Foundation to the NCAA. So if there's ever been somebody who, as he just told me a few minutes ago, his wife says he can't hold a job, who is a very adept and very relevant message for us today. So please join me in welcoming CBS Chief Legal all of a sudden I can't talk. Maybe it's because I'm with a broadcaster. Chief Legal Analyst Jack Ford. Thank you.
Charlie, thank you. This is probably the, I think, 4th or 5th time that I've been down here to the Meek School. It's one of my favorite places to come visit. I always make sure I schedule it around a good football game. And as I told your athletic director yesterday, the last 5 times I've been here, Ole Miss has won, including 2 years ago against Alabama. So his response is, we're inviting you every year for every important game to come down and see if we can keep that streak going. Anyway, it's one of the things that I most enjoy doing on my travels is meeting up with students, especially journalism students. I've spent the last 30 years of my life doing journalism, and I've seen enormous changes over that time. It's a different world for you all than it was for me when I first started doing this. But what I thought we would do is talk a little bit about the notion of journalism and the media. And I also thought, let's do something other than politics, because I think everybody's sort of worn down at this point on presidential politics. And one of the things that I have been talking about for a number of years has been the intersection of college sports and the media, and how it is that the media crafts the contours and drives the narrative and the perceptions of college sports. What has always been interesting to me, especially most recently, is this very unique paradox. That is that college sports have never been more popular than they are now. I think a recent poll, a Harris Interactive poll about a year or so ago, said almost 50% of Americans polled describe themselves as college sports fans, whether they were affiliated with an institution or ever played games. Let me get a sampling. How many of you would describe yourself at some degree as a college sports fan? Right. So this is even higher than that, not surprising. But the paradox is that the institutions involved with college sports, right? The academic institutions themselves, coaches, the NCAA, have never been more unpopular. And I found it to be interesting. I mean, if you look at the NCAA, you can say that it's almost even vilified. Now, a couple of things, full disclosure, all right, for you perhaps soon-to-be journalists. I've been involved in various capacities with the NCAA for probably 15 years, maybe a little bit longer. It started, I had gotten one of their awards that they give, their annual award, they call it a 25th anniversary award, and It's going to, their words, not mine. They say a former outstanding college athlete who's achieved distinction in their profession on the anniversary of their 25th graduation from college. So I received that a number of years ago. And afterwards, I started connecting with them and doing some things. I served on their honors committee where we choose various honorees each year, current students, former students, public figures. I started hosting that honors gala, they call it, part of their annual convention. And just recently, I've started, again, sort of kind of working with the NCAA, not for the NCAA. They've asked some people who have had experiences as college athletes to if they're traveling around, to share their perspectives on things. And they asked me if I'd do that. I said I'd be delighted, because I do it often anyway. As I say to people, look, I am an apostle for the values of college athletics. I was raised by a single mother. My father disappeared on us when I was about 5 years old. Left my mother literally on a street corner with 4 children, 7, 5, 3, and 1. My mom was just turned 94, still my hero. Went back to college when she was almost 40 years old, got her teaching degree so she could raise her 4 kids by herself. I'm not going to college unless somebody else is going to pay for it. And as I say to both of my children, I went to Yale, played football there. My children, my daughter and son did also. My daughter's a cancer surgeon, son's a banker. And I say to them, not entirely facetiously, I'm not so sure I'm getting into Yale if I'm not a football player. So for me, that great transformative period of my time was the ability to get to college, to get to a place that I would not have gotten to if I wasn't an athlete, and to get out of there and to bring with me everything I got from there. I was fortunate enough to be inducted into Yale's Hall of Fame a couple of years ago. And as I said at my induction, I showed up here as a freshman with literally everything I owned in a duffel bag, everything I owned. And I left 4 years later with everything I would need for the rest of my life. And my hope is that you'll all have that same feeling when you leave college. There's something about this that changes lives and gives them direction. So, as I said, I agreed to do that and to drop into some places and to talk with students, to talk with adults. I was in Washington yesterday hosting a congressional breakfast with a number of Congress people, talking with them also about collegiate athletics. And again, full disclosure, I'm careful to say to people, I am not told what to say. I don't get talking points or agendas. And what I do is not speak for the NCAA, but about the NCAA and college sports. And most important, what I do is to try to focus on some of the issues that are going on. And that's what I want to do here with you. When I talked to Charlie, when I talked to Will about coming down here, I said, here's the deal. I would love to come down, and I'd love to talk, but I really would like it to be a conversation. And I said to them, as a matter of fact, I think when we first talked, I said to Charlie, let's do this. These are all journalism students. Hopefully, let's let them hone their interviewing skills. And I'm going to talk a little bit about some things, and then I'm going to toss out issues here. And my hope is I'm going to ask for some opinions from you, and my hope is you're going to give them, maybe ask some questions of me, to make this a little bit interactive, a sort of a thoughtful dialogue here. And I'm hoping you're okay with that, right? Because, I can stand here and talk for an hour or something. I'm a lawyer and a journalist. We can talk forever if we have to. But I'd prefer it be a conversation here with us. All right, you all good with that? Good. So when I talk about that intriguing paradox of incredible popularity for sports and the institutions being so challenged in public opinions, and it's puzzling to me in some ways. But what I do is I look at the media. And how the media frames the contours here. And let's understand something, and you know this, but I say this to people who are not well-versed in journalism. Yeah, the media is not a monolithic entity. There's not a single media with a capital M. As you know, we've had this explosion of media platforms and journalistic platforms, so-called journalistic platforms. So when I use the term media, I'm not talking about everybody, obviously. But we've had this explosion. And it corresponded with the explosion of college sports and the popularity of college sports. And it's interesting because they're parallels, if you think about it. You know, both college sports, both the media, they provide entertainment, they provide information. If you think about it, they provide a form of social integration. You know, sports bring all sorts of people together, as various media platforms do. And they also, in some ways, sometimes, in the best sense, in the best times, can create social change. You know, think about the role that the media has had in driving conversations. Think of the role that sports have had in getting people out in front. We see it right now with what's going on with the idea started by Colin Kaepernick, the idea of kneeling or sitting in the national anthem and during the national anthem, and how it's driven conversation. Right? So that's what you get from that intersection of the media and sports. And why is that? Well, you know, one of the things that I've talked about in the past, and I think even the last time I was down here 4 or 5 years, I talked about it, and that was how the media has changed over the years. When I started doing television news, I kind of stumbled into it. Right? I wasn't nearly as prepared as you all will. I graduated from college, I went to law school, I knew I wanted to be a trial lawyer. I was prosecutor for a number of years, and I got into private practice. I tried everything from death penalty cases to antitrust cases. And the way I got into television was I had been asked by a number of groups if I would defend the first death penalty case up in the Northeast. Many of you history majors, you might remember in 1972, the US Supreme Court threw out the death penalty. But then allowed states to reinstitute it as long as they adhered to certain standards. So the first death penalty case in the Northeast was going to be tried, and I was asked by a number of groups to do it. And because it was the first of the death penalty cases, we got a lot of media attention. Cameras in our courtroom. This is 1984 and 1985, before cameras in the courtroom were a regular thing. And when it was over, I did a bunch of interviews. And I did one for the CBS affiliate in New York City, and the news director said to me afterwards, it was a live interview, came out and he said, "You seem comfortable. Have you done television before?" And I said, "You know what, my football coach at Yale," and this was in the 70s when the Ivies were still major powers, had a weekly New England show. And I had actually helped put myself through law school on Jeopardy. I was on Jeopardy a bunch of times and won a lot of money and paid for my last year of law school on Jeopardy. So I said to him, that was my TV experience. And he said, "Well, how'd you like to come on and do some stuff with us?" So it started where I'd come on once a week and talk about cases. And then after 4 or 5 years, I was doing much more television than trying cases. And then eventually transitioned full-time into journalism. So it was, I've described it as an accidental career. Although interestingly, the training of a trial lawyer coincided with the training, much of the training of journalists. So when I get started, there were 3 networks. That was it. There was no internet. And there was this sort of strange newcomer called cable news, you know, CNN. And people were saying, "Well, what is cable news? What does that all mean?" That's where you got your news, on television. You know, 3 networks, they each had a nightly news show, they each had a morning show, they each had a magazine, and that was pretty much it. That and obviously newspapers, magazines. Many more of them then than there are now. Look at your world, and look at the platforms that are available to you if you want to pursue journalism. It's you know, my friend Tom Brokaw, I worked with for years at NBC News, who used to be the lead anchor of NBC News, one of the legendary figures in television news. And Tom describes it as the Big Bang Theory of journalism, which is, you know, during that period of time, there was this explosion. And as a consequence, there are now all of these platforms that are available. Many of them are truly journalism platforms. You know, the difficulty is nowadays, you know, you have to be careful so that you can differentiate between a real journalism platform and the guy in his pajamas in his mother's basement who's got his computer and he's holding himself out as whatever he wants to hold himself out as a journalist. But much of this explosion was driven by opinion. You know, opinion has always been part of the news. You know, you go back, look at none of you studied, you know, mass media. Most newspapers got started because they had a point of view. You know, there was I forget which newspaper it was in the state of Tennessee, literally got started as an arm of Andrew Jackson's presidential campaign. They started saying, okay, we'll do some commercials, make some money, but we are here for the sole purpose of getting Andrew Jackson elected president. when I first started doing television news, sort of be a quaint notion, if I let my opinion seep into any of my reporting, I literally would be yanked off the air. Can you imagine that today? I mean, can you turn on a cable network at night to any news program that's not driven entirely by opinion? The answer is no, and that's how things have changed so dramatically. So opinion now is a driving force. It's not a bad thing. No, Thomas Jefferson said opinion is power. Opinion has always been part of the world of journalism. But one of the difficulties that I've seen, I've talked about before, is the idea of opinion overwhelming fact reporting. And I've seen so many instances, especially now with the creation and the growth of cable news networks and the internet, where we're bombarded by opinion. I wish I could take credit for the comment. I can't. Somebody else said it before me. But the idea is, look, we're all entitled to our own opinions. What you're not entitled to are your own facts. And yet, you turn on sort of any of the cable networks, any of the broadcast networks, and at some point in time, you're going to find somebody saying something, and you're going to say to yourself, yeah, where did you get that from? What's your basis for all of that? And we've seen that carry over into sports. I pointed to the O.J. Simpson murder trial, which I covered. I spent 9 months in that courtroom in Los Angeles as kind of a springboard into the area of all opinion all the time. How many of you are familiar with the O.J. Simpson murder trial? Okay. Any of you see the movie that was out that they did last spring, or the documentary, the ESPN documentary? Who saw that? Who saw that? Let's ask the documentary first. Who saw the documentary? All right. Documentary, really well done. Again, having lived through it for 9 months, it's nice. The movie was, it was pretty well done. Although it being Hollywood, it used to drive me nuts how many times they tried to introduce the Kardashian girls into if you saw the movie, it's like every scene had somebody saying, because remember, the reason, for those of you who didn't follow it, the O.J. Simpson's best friend was Robert Kardashian, the father of those marvelously talented young ladies. And they were literally like 7 or 8 years old when this happened. And yet somehow when they're writing the movie, they had to write scenes where they make up a scene completely, where they have O.J. Simpson threatening to take his life. And the guy, David Schwimmer, was playing Robert Kardashian, bursts into the room and he says, "No, Juice, you can't do this, not in Kimmy's bedroom." And I'm thinking, come on, really? Yeah. So the movie was pretty good, except for that. The documentary is exceptional. And one of the things I think the documentary captured is the extraordinary public attention that was focused on O.J. And this sort of ties into the sports theme because of who he was. Any of you know it's a better way to ask it. If I asked you today, who is the most popular sports figure in this country? Give me some answers. Peyton Manning? LeBron James? Who? Steph Curry? Michael Jordan still? I mean, we could come up with probably 10 right off the top of our heads, and every one of them would be defensible. All right? If we were sitting in this room in 1972, 73, 74, and I asked that same question, there'd be one answer: O.J. Simpson. One answer. That was it. Rags to riches story. As a child, had medical ailments. His mother was told he probably would not be able to walk. Raised by a single mother, becomes Heisman Trophy winner. NFL is in both the College Hall of Fame and the NFL Hall of Fame. If you're a football fan, the first NFL running back ever to go over 2,000 yards. He does it in a 14-game season, not the 16-game season that other people have done it on. And he was charming and charismatic. One of the most successful crossover guys who was able to take his athletic career and cross over into things afterwards, and to be almost as successful as he was as an athlete. He was literally beloved across the board. He transcended race. One of the early athletes where people would say he transcended race. It's interesting because the irony of that is that during the course of his time, the only criticism you ever heard directed at him, similarly to what you've seen directed at Tiger Woods, even at Michael Jordan, was that he almost rejected his race. But that didn't become a factor until the trial. So O.J. Simpson, when he's charged with murder, it's an enormous deal. Right? Happened 20 years ago. So you guys you were barely alive when this is taking place. But ask your parents about it. because it was so popular that the day the verdict was returned live on television, and the jury came back and announced they had a verdict, the judge said, we're going to come in tomorrow morning and announce it. The judge was concerned, security, a lot of things. So they do the verdict live on television in the morning. All right. How many, somebody give me an idea of a television show that's popular today. How many viewers do you get? A top show? 20 million, maybe, something like that, right? 120 million people watched live the O.J. Simpson verdict. It's more than Super Bowls. 120 million people watched it live. It just grabbed the country. I tell a story, a true story, mildly humorous, but true, but it illustrates that overwhelming interest in the trial. It was about 2 or 3 months into it. It was a 9-month trial. It went way too long, but people just stayed plugged into it. I was with NBC News at the time as their chief legal correspondent. I was also hosting the Today Show on the weekend. So I was back and forth from LA to New York City. And when I was in New York for a couple of days, what I'd do is every morning, either from LA or New York, I'd start off on the Today Show. So I'd be either the top story or the second and third story and talk about here's what happened yesterday in the O.J. trial, here's what's going to happen today. Then if I was in New York, we would do every hour, on the hour starting at noontime, a 2-minute live hit before every show. I mean, can you imagine that nowadays watching the network, that they would take away 2 minutes, which was basically commercial time, every hour from noontime until 9 o'clock, because it was a West Coast trial, and do a live 2-hour, again, here's what's going on, let's dip in live to the courtroom, this is the witness, this is what they're saying. So we do that all day long. So NBC was very good about the fact that, I was starting my day at about 4 in the morning and not finishing up till about 9 o'clock at night. So when I was in New York, I get off the Today Show at about 7:15. I wasn't going to be on there at noontime, and so I go to a hotel right there in Rockefeller Center and basically take a nap for a couple hours and then come back, be on the air at noontime. So I was doing it on a sort of regular basis. So a couple of months into the trial, about 3 months into the trial, I'm in New York, so I do the Today Show, go over to the hotel, go check in, and the guy on the counter says, by this time they know you and say, oh, Mr. Ford, good to see you again, here's your key, you're on floor 11. I take the key, I'm about to head up, and one of the managers comes back in and he says, no, put Mr. Ford up in one of the suites, up in the 47th floor. And I said, I'm only going to be here for a couple hours, just taking a nap. Thank you, but I really don't. And he insisted, no, please, we want to do this for you. I said, thanks. This becomes important in a moment. So I go up to the 47th floor, jump in bed, I'm taking a nap. About an hour in, all of a sudden, alarms start going off. So I jump out of bed, pick up the phone's dead. No electricity, no power in the room. I look down the window and I can see that the hotel is surrounded by fire trucks and police cars, emergency services vehicles. So a keenly trained, analytical, legal mind says, I should probably leave and get out of here. I'm on the 47th floor. There's no power. There's no elevator. So I get to the corner, start working my way down the stairwell. And I get to about the 34th floor, and I come across 2 older foreign women. I don't know what language they spoke, but I didn't speak it. And I'm trying to convince them to come with me, and they're frightened, understand that. I'm trying to convince them to come with me. So I'm doing what you do when you're talking to somebody who doesn't understand your language. I'm talking very loud, thinking somehow if I talk loud, they'll understand English. And finally, I get them to understand. I want them to come with me. And I convince them, come on, we got to leave. We have to go. So we start down 34 floors. I convince them to leave. What I can't convince them to do is leave their luggage. I'm carrying their bags, 34 floors, thinking if I get down and find the guy who put me up on the 47th floor, we're going to have a serious conversation. So finally, we work our way down there. We get down to the courtyard. It sounds fairly melodramatic, but it's true. There's some double doors there. I sort of kick open the doors. They swing out. Smoke comes out. Here I come. I got the ladies. I'm still carrying their bags. And a fireman runs up to me, all right? Now, you'd think his first question is going to be, are you okay? Are the ladies okay? Anybody else inside? I swear to you, comes up to me and he says, so what do you think, Jack? Did O.J. really do it? And I remember thinking, really? With all the questions you could possibly ask me, that's the first one that comes to your mind. But for me, it was just symbolic of how the O.J. trial had taken over literally taken over the country. And how so much of it, and it was, not the first trial to be driven by opinion, but it was the first, I've always held, and a lot of people agree with me, I've always held it was the first modern trial to be driven so by opinion, and introduce sort of a cottage industry of people doing what I was already doing, which is sort of showing up on the courthouse steps and offering analysis of what went on in the trial that day. I always thought it was kind of silly when they would ask lawyers, for a nightly news quick bite, who won today? Who won the trial today? And I'm looking at these people saying, you know what, guys, I've tried a couple of dozen murder cases. I've tried half a dozen death penalty cases. One of the first things I learned, I used to teach in law school, one of the first things I learned, you have no idea what's going on in jurors' minds. You're kidding yourself and everybody else if you think you can project what that is. But it became, again, a driving force of opinion. And we see today, when we look at the world of college sports, there are so many issues. And so much of it is driven by the media. Some of it is very good. We see investigative reporting. We see the Baylor case. You're familiar with what the case down at Baylor, where a number of young women had come forward and they said they had been sexually assaulted by football players. And they said that essentially coaches tried to convince them to go away or to not come forward or to change their stories. And essentially were basically trying to sweep all of this under the rug. And it had gone on for a while, and you had had good investigative reporting that brought it all out. But there's other reporting that doesn't rise to that level, but still forms opinions. Let me talk about a couple of these issues. Here's the first question for you. How many of you think that college athletes, and here we're talking about primarily the ones involved in money making, college football, men's basketball, to some extent women's basketball. How many of you think that those athletes should be paid in addition to their college scholarships? Who wants to tell me why? David, you were the first hand up. You get to tell me why. Why do you think that?
Because, it's a job. The amount of hours that they put into the sport and the amount of money that the school takes home from those college sports, it's almost not even fair.
Mm-hmm. Who else? Anybody have thoughts? Back.
They make money off of jerseys that have their likenesses, like Johnny Manziel has the highest sold jersey in NFL history.
Right. Anybody else?
And they're going to be playing here, risking injury before they go to the NFL. So if they're not to make it in the long run, be getting something now.
Yes.
I think there's a way to do it where you're not directly paying them like a salary per se, but you're allowing them to get royalties off of their own merchandise. And like Terrell Pryor with his issue way back in the day, he sold his jersey. It's his jersey website.
Who thinks no? Who thinks that there should not be paid additional money? Why not? Who wants to jump in? Your hand went up first. You get to go first. Why do you think no? Yes.
Well, I understand the commitment that college athletes are making, and we obviously appreciate everything that they do to better the institution. And I think that as far as paying them, I don't think that's quite fair. I think there's ways to support college athletes, whereas full rides, obviously, and everything's already compensated for them. That it's a personal choice to join the team. They said that you have to play football in college, kind of thing. And I think there's some really great community college options now that are less expensive, so it's not like that you have to go to college and play football to pay for college kind of thing.
For playing off of that theory, for those of you that said yes, you think they should be paid, is there a problem with what that suggests then about the value of a college scholarship and the value of a college education? David, doesn't that theory, if you say, okay, here's what you're going to do, we're going to pay you for the reasons we talked about here, doesn't that necessarily suggest then that the $30,000, $40,000, $50,000, $60,000 a year that represents the value of their scholarship, and the idea that you're saying you're getting a college education here, doesn't that seem to suggest that that's not important? What do you think?
Well, the thing thing is that when you look at the football team, the millions of dollars they bring in a year, risking their bodies out there. I mean, I just don't, I don't think they should be bringing in $100,000 a year. But I mean, there's tons of students on campus who, have on-campus jobs and they get compensated minimum wage for it. Why can't the football players who are doing something for the university to make the university look good get compensated more than just free tuition? I mean, there has to be some sort of more compromise for this. I feel
Yeah,
like.
but can you say that about intramural sports? College students are participating in intramurals and risking their bodies and injuries to make it competitive.
No, that's nothing like it.
Yeah,
But let me ask you this. Let me ask it this way, all right, to sort of devil's advocate this and keep the conversation going. As a comparison point, suppose that somebody came to you and said, all right, you want to be a journalism major, you want to, and hopefully become a journalist. Here's what we're going to do. Here's what I'm going to offer you. I'm going to offer you enrollment at the University of Mississippi, and you can be part of the Meek School of Journalism. And you're going to work really, really hard. You're going to write for the magazine. You're going to do blogs. You're going to do research. You're going to get involved in all sorts of new media. You're going to do that in addition to whatever other courses you're taking. Right? And in response, or in return for all of that, we're going to give you a full scholarship. We're going to pay for your room, your board, your tuition, your fees, and now, because of what they're doing with the Power 5 conferences, now we're going to pay you also the difference between that and the real cost of your college experience. When I was being recruited, when I was coming out of high school, they called it laundry money for us. You got room, board, tuition, fees, books, and what they called laundry money. Like 18-year-old guys, I was like, I'm going to take my stuff to the laundry, to the cleaners, to get it all done. It was your beer and pizza money, and that's what everybody knew it was, but they called it something different. Now they call it the difference, the gap, if you would. So why is that different? Now, I know the most obvious difference is you're not going to blow out your knee as a journalist, okay? All right. But why is the concept, or is it different? Is that different between what I'm offering you as a journalism page to do something you love to do, and you'd probably do for free? If you ask football players, they're there because they love playing football. I wish I could have played forever. So do something you love to do, and in response for doing something you love to do, your entire college education is going to be paid for. How about that? Does that change your mind at all? Change your mind at all?
Well, I would like to know how much more money the University of Mississippi or the Meek School of Journalism would be generating from me being a full-time, employee of the school in comparison to how much money the university makes as having an athlete who is basically a full-time football player.
It's a good question. And the money that's a significant issue. And it's going to get us, we're going to talk about coaches' salaries and all those things in a minute. So the money is significant because you hear a lot about the money, and where it all goes. Let me one thing that I think is important to factor into this conversation. Only a handful, and you might have seen this before, only a handful of athletic departments basically operate in the black. And only a handful of college football programs, with the money they bring in, are able to run themselves without looking to the academic institution for subsidies. I don't know if you all pay a student fee. A lot of colleges, there's a sort of a student fee that's part of your tuition, room, board, fees, and costs. And for a lot of them, those student fees are used to subsidize athletic programs. Because the reality is, a university might say bring in $15 million in terms of their television rights, their share of it, and their gate receipts and everything, and their endorsements, but it might cost them $20 million to run it. Okay, so again, the fiscal reality is very few schools are literally bringing in more than they're paying out. Now, of course, that raises other issues. Are they being responsible in what they're paying for? So you start off with that premise. And we hear oftentimes people talking about the NCAA. This is where the NCAA conversation comes in, and all the money that they bring in. All right. While we're in this conversation, let me introduce the NCAA. How many of you think the NCAA does a good job as the governing body for collegiate athletics? Well, there's a resounding response. Why not? Right? Nobody here agrees they do a good job. Somebody tell me why not. Yes?
You got probably the biggest academic sports scandal in the history of the NCAA in North Carolina. You got the rape scandal in Baylor. You got bull crap going on here.
Right.
I got nothing good to say about it. There's a lot of oversight.
It's a great point, and it's something that I've heard before. Here's my question. Why do you directly relate Baylor, North Carolina? And here is different, because we're talking about an investigation that's taken forever. You know, and it's, look, again, full disclosure, I used to sit on the Division I Committee on Infractions. So I've sat in on some of these cases. When I signed up for a number of years ago, they asked you to make a list of some places that you have affiliations with so you wouldn't be involved with them. You know, clearly Yale, my law school, I actually put down Ole Miss that I have enough of an affiliation affinity with not to put me on it. So I have not been involved in that at all. I don't know anything more about it than you all know from what you see in the media. It has taken a long, long time. And I think most people would probably say too long. The same thing about the NCAA. So are you talking then in terms of the infractions process that does not suggest to you that they're doing a good job because it's taking years to get these things resolved?
There's absolutely that, but then there's an inconsistency on points as well.
Right.
That's the big thing. You got the SDA penalty. You know, it's just they're all over the place.
Yeah.
It seems like a very disorganized system. They just can't get. There's no precedent they set.
Yeah.
It's kind of a case-to-case thing, and I just think that's. I don't know.
It's interesting. What I learned about it is that, and this is something that a lot of people don't realize, and I learned a lot of things that obviously I agree with what you're saying. But one of the things I learned is that a lot of people in the media didn't understand what the NCAA was about. So for instance, I agree with you entirely about North Carolina State taking a long time, North Carolina, and Ole Miss taking a long time. Baylor, I think, is a different story. I do a lot of sports radio talk shows when there is an intersection of the law and sports, and I was on one of the major ESPN radio shows when the Baylor thing popped out. And one of the hosts said to me, well, shouldn't the NCAA be all over this tomorrow? And I said to him, well, I said, here's the thing. You have to understand what the NCAA is. You know, it's an umbrella organization. It represents 1,100 institutions. There's not a single entity that is the NCAA. I said, you know, it's not like a privately held company where the CEO can wake up tomorrow morning and say, we're going to change policies. As of today, we now do things completely different. Because it is so big, it's quite candidly, it's cumbersome. I mean, they don't make rules. The president or the executives don't make rules. The rules are made by the member institutions, colleges themselves. And as you can imagine, you have 1,100 colleges under the umbrella of this. Now they're divided into groups, Division I, II, and III. But even within those groups, there are significantly different interests going on. So to get something done it's very difficult and it's cumbersome. And as I said to them, Baylor, if it's true, okay, and that's the caveat, and this is sort of the lawyer in me that comes out, because I've seen too many situations where allegations don't turn out to be true. This one sounds like there's an awful lot going on terrible there, but we haven't heard all of the facts yet. But what I said on the air is, let's assume it's true. It's terrible. The fact that there were sexual assaults to start with is horrendous. The fact that then responsible adults, coaches, administrators, tried to suppress that and tried to essentially frighten these women into not coming forward with their stories is even worse. So if that's true, the stories and the consequences are horrendous. But here's the interesting thing. That's not an NCAA violation. Now you might say to me, how can you possibly say that? Well, because if it happened, was it criminal, the sexual assaults? Absolutely. Might it also be criminal that the adults were trying to suppress this? Yeah, it might. It could easily be obstruction of justice. And that's a criminal event where you can go to jail. So there may well be significant criminal offenses taking place here. Forget about the ethics and morality of an academic institution, trying to hide the fact of sexual assaults by their student athletes. But none of that, they're violations of civil law, of criminal law, of morals and ethics, but they're not NCAA violations. Just because a crime takes place on a college campus committed by a student athlete doesn't make it an NCAA violation. Now, I think the NCAA is looking to sort of change. They have to get people to change their rules. There's an NCAA resolution that came out years ago saying to the institutions, look, this is what you have to do to investigate sexual assault charges. You can't just make them go away. You've got responsibilities. But they haven't made them hard and fast rules where if somebody violated it, then the NCAA could come in and say, all right, now in addition to your criminal charges, now we're looking at suspensions and probations and losing scholarships and not playing in bowls. But curiously, now what happened in Baylor, as awful as it is, at this juncture is not an NCAA violation. What happens is people tend to think that if it happens on a campus, it must be. So, we're going back. So we're talking about the NCAA, and we're kind of going back now to the notion of paying, right? And we talked about some of the arguments on both sides, all right? What about the money that coaches make? High profile, successful coaches, football, basketball. Sometimes 4, 5, 6, maybe more times more than the chancellors or presidents of the university makes, than Nobel laureates on the faculty makes. Are we okay with that? Anybody, better question, anybody not okay with that? Who is okay with it? And who doesn't care? Who said they're okay with it? Somebody give me an answer why. Yes?
The money they bring in.
Mm-hmm.
They say it's made Alabama how many millions of dollars in like 8 years.
Right. And it's tough to argue. If you look just at a cost-benefit analysis, it's like any other business. If you have a high producer, if you're in the insurance business and you have somebody who's out there producing way more than anybody else, you're going to pay him way more than anybody else. But what's the downside to it? Accepting what you say, from the economic perspective, yes, makes sense. What's the downside to it? To that idea? Somebody make the argument for me. What are the optics of it?
Placing value on coaches instead of like college classes, teachers, everything.
Yeah, and if you talk about what the mission of an academic institution is, right, and the fact that we're seeing now a lot of budgets being cut, especially in the public schools, the state schools, departments are being either eliminated or cut back. There's something that's awfully troubling to a lot of people about the optics of that. Yes, they're very successful. Yes, they bring in a lot of money, but does it make sense for us to step in and do something about it? Who thinks the NCAA could step in? Anybody who doesn't like the idea, would you suggest that the NCAA step in and say, from now on, we're going to put a ceiling on how much money coaches can be paid? Who thinks that's a good idea?
I think it's a good idea based on the financial situation of the university. If you look at a school like LSU, that's in debt, and they have their board of directors who try to buy out Les Miles' contract even though they're broke. I think like schools like that should get penalized if they spend more money on athletics than they're already in debt.
Mm-hmm. Who else? Anybody else thinks that the NCAA should step in and say, look, let's get reasonable, let's put a limit on the ceiling on this? Yes, Dave.
What I don't like specifically is when coaches have endorsements when their athletes aren't allowed to take an endorsement for money. So I think if they were to step in and say, all right, we're not going to let our players be endorsed, then we shouldn't let the coaches be endorsed.
And that certainly would give you some sense of consistency.
Yeah.
Yeah. Here's the problem. Actually, the NCAA tried to do that, to put a ceiling on coaches' salaries. Now, curiously, this is about 20 years ago. Curiously, they started at the bottom. They started saying, okay, we're going to put a ceiling on basically the lowest level, one level above graduate assistants, where you're making some money, but you're not making a whole lot. And you know, the schools and the conferences have put limits on the number of coaches you could have, but essentially they left the budgets to each individual institution. And there was a push for sort of economic restraint, and the NCAA jumped in and said, all right, from now on, these, what they call them restricted earnings coaches, can only make so much money. What do you think happened? Take a guess. Where do most things end up that are contested in our society? In court. Right. So lawsuit was started, and basically, NCAA was told, you can't do that. It's an antitrust violation. Right? Antitrust, if you studied it all, basically, the idea is if you create what's called an unreasonable restraint of trade. So if we all get together and we manufacture things and we say, we're going to agree on this is the price and only this price, well, that's an antitrust violation because it doesn't allow anybody else to negotiate with their people. And that's what the court said about the NCAA stepping in. So it's, again, one of these things when you sort of look at it, the problem. Is it a problem? Yeah. For a lot of people, it is. You know, people will say, look, it's a free market, and maybe the universities themselves should be more responsible. You know, maybe each university, if they said, we are not on our own, we don't care about what everybody else in our conference does, we're not going to pay more than $1 million a year for a coach. All right? You think there's any chance of that happening? Nowadays? Probably not, you know, with the arms race that's going on. So what you have is, you know, these competing forces, you know, market forces driving up the salaries, the coaches or their agents being able to say, if you're Nick Saban, if you're you know, Dabo Swinney down at Clemson, you're winning a lot of games, you're bringing people into your building, you're generating a lot of revenues for the university. You know, the money that comes in from sports is used across the university. So there's a value not just to the sports department, you know, and free market forces will say they should get whatever it is they want to pay. So then it becomes up to the individual institutions to say, are we going to step in and do this? And nowadays, as you've seen, there's such an arms race, that's probably not going to happen. Let's talk about some other issues that are out there. Let's talk about the most recent one. The NCAA, just a couple of days ago, stepped in and said, we are no longer going to allow any NCAA championship events to take place in the state of North Carolina. Did you see that? Who's familiar with that, the story? Right. Background real quickly. What happened is last year, the North Carolina legislature passed a law, and this is one area where I think that the media has fallen down in terms of the coverage. Because most people, if they follow the media, think the law was about, it's become called the bathroom bill, right? And what it said was in public buildings, people are required to use the bathroom that corresponds to their gender on their birth certificate, right? And that's the way it's been played out. The reality is that was only a small part of the bill. The bigger part of the bill, and the more troubling part for a lot of legal scholars and other folks in the public, was the North Carolina legislature prohibited any municipality from passing any ordinances that would provide protections, legal protections, to LGBT people. Right, so the state said, you people in the towns cannot do that. And they said, also, by the way, here's what we're doing with the bathrooms in public buildings. Again, much of the reporting has been terrible. The first part, I think, you've heard constitutional scholars and other social activists saying the first part is more troubling. The idea of a state saying to municipalities, you can't do this. We're not going to let you do that, even though you think that's what you and your people want to do. So a number of months ago, the NBA came out. They're the first ones to come out and say, we're pulling our All-Star game from Charlotte in 2017. We've had a number of major corporations expressing their concern about this. They haven't done anything about it, but they've said we might choose to pull out some of our offices or take some kind of stand about this. The NCAA came out this week and said, we are, as long as this bill is in place, we are going to prohibit any of our championship events from taking place in North Carolina. So here's the question. Is that the right thing for the NCAA to do? Give me a show of hands. How many think yes? How many think no? How many have no thoughts whatsoever? You know what the other state is? Only one other state. Mississippi. Only one other state where NCAA championships are not allowed to take place. You know why? Passed the same bill. And also back years ago, because of the flying of the Confederate flag at sports events. So is that, let's forget about the facts of this case, because that could be the subject of an entirely different conversation. But just talk about the idea. Should the NCAA be able to prohibit events from taking place in a particular state because of legalities or politics within that state? Is that a role that the NCAA should have? What do you think? Who thinks yes? Why do you think?
They have the ability to influence what could change. Maybe it'll change things if it's an important enough issue.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Well, I think if you look at it like a business, if they go to a state like that, they don't want to seem like they're in favor of it, and they don't want to lose financial support from other organizations.
Mm-hmm.
So it's money. I think it's because of money.
Yeah. Anybody else think yes or no? Yes, Ross.
Your opening comments, you said sports had never been at an all-time, more than an all-time high, but those governing bodies have never been perceived at an all-time low. I guess my question is, sports used to be kind of the safe haven where all kinds of people could come into a stadium and you knew who the enemy was, so to speak. You know, I mean, good guy, good gal, and who the opponent was. And I'm curious, as an analyst and as a journalist, is that the case because sports has politicized it in many ways and gotten involved in the political arena where it's no longer just about the game and the opponent? And I've heard other journalists kind of deal with that dynamic that's engaged, in covering sports especially.
I guess the question is, let's sort of, there was a referendum and carry up on, should the world of sports be sort of carved out and not engage in anything such as what the NCAA did here, saying we are going to respond to what the state legislature did and pull back? Should it be a safe haven? Thinks yes. Somebody think it shouldn't be a safe haven, that it has to be intertwined in some fashion? You guys are way too smart not to have opinions on this. Yes?
I definitely think it should play a role. Sports, like you said, sports are at an all-time high right now, so it'd be completely just like ignorant for them not to have an opinion or not to play a role, because they can change the way so many people feel about a certain situation. They can help a lot of people form opinions. It doesn't matter necessarily what they did. It doesn't matter necessarily that they did pull out. It matters that they started and initiated the conversation.
Yeah. Yes?
To play devil's advocate, who's the NCAA to make that decision? Who are they to say what people should believe versus shouldn't believe?
Well, that's the interesting issue, because there are a lot of people who have said that, look, there's some very good and honest, decent people who agree with the legislation in North Carolina. And there are good and honest and decent people who disagree with it. So the question becomes, who gets to be the arbiter? Who gets to say, what's the right position to take and how we're going to respond to it? Yes?
I think that, I do not like the bill at all. I'm against it. The bill's even there, but I think that if individual players take a stance on something, that's different.
Or how about other schools? Could schools say, we're not going to come down there and play you?
Yeah, and like Kaepernick, I don't know how to pronounce it correctly, but like him doing that, like that's his right. But if the NCAA were to say, okay, we're not going to play the national anthem until people are more involved with the Black Lives Matter movement, it'd be different than when he does it. People would be more mad about the NCAA doing it. Like them as individuals, it's okay for them to have an opinion, but I don't know if it's okay for this group to like do something.
Suppose we were talking about a less controversial issue where there was less disagreement on it. Right? Suppose we were, going back to the days, the civil rights movements in the 50s and in the 60s. And suppose you had a state that for whatever reason said, well, we're going to create something that really sounds an awful lot like segregation. Would it be okay for the NCAA to step in and do something in that kind of an issue, where the vast majority of people, you certainly hope and we believe, would agree, no, that's wrong, right? As opposed to the LGBT issue, which, as I said, you have good and honest, decent people on both sides of that. I'm not going to try to tell you what's right or wrong on that issue. Would that make a difference? I'll come to you. Would that make a difference? If it was a clearly defined conduct that is detrimental to society, should the NCAA be playing that role? What do you think?
I mean, that's
It's a harder question.
Because it's like, if I say yes, then my argument's gone.
Mm-hmm.
I get that big public figures can make a change that is important and needed, because that's hard. Because
Yeah.
like, I don't know, when it's less controversial though, like when everyone knows, hey, that's wrong.
Right. That's an easier one to sign on to. How about Colin Kaepernick? How many of you feel, and I'm not asking whether you agree or disagree with his positions, but how many of you feel that his conduct is appropriate? Do you know what I'm talking about? You guys follow this? Colin Kaepernick, backup quarterback for the 49ers, and has chosen, and sort of did it without any fanfare to start off at the beginning of the season, has chosen not to stand on the field when the national anthem is played. In the beginning, he was sitting. Now he kneels. But he's chosen not to stand. And when asked about it, he said because he wants to bring attention to issues that he thinks are important. Problems with race in this country, problems with poverty in this country. And he's chosen to express that by not standing for the national anthem. How many of you feel that if that's what he wants to do, that's appropriate conduct? Who thinks no? Let's talk about the no's first, okay? Because why you think it's appropriate, I just sort of expressed it. Why do you think no? Somebody give me an answer for why no. You said no. Why do you think? Yes?
I just think, there's certain ways that you can express everybody obviously entitled that to you, and there's other ways you could have went about expressing it. I just think, as far as not standing for the national anthem, that represents something much larger than just one issue. And to me, it was disrespectful.
Mm-hmm.
And I have family that's in the military,
Mm-hmm.
and he wouldn't even be playing the game that he loves to play if not police soldiers who have died for that. So.
Mm-hmm. Yes?
For me, it's not an issue of the conversation he raised, but again, the way he did it. It's not standing for the national anthem. Again, military, family, it's disrespectful.
So not the content, but the process, essentially. Yes?
I just have a question. I'm just confused how kneeling during the Pledge of Allegiance raises. I just don't understand by his act what is he trying to accomplish.
Mm-hmm.
What is the main issue?
Mm-hmm.
I haven't been following it.
Mm-hmm.
He's getting this conversation started, so I think that's exactly what we wanted.
Yeah.
What
I mean,
is the conversation?
well, it's interesting because it has started a conversation. People have said in support of him, they said he's doing it. We're talking about it today, right? He started a conversation. So people on the other side have said, well, it's not as if we haven't been talking about race problems and haven't been talking about police excesses and haven't been talking about poverty. That's been out. It's not as if Colin Kaepernick invented that. It's been out there.
Why is this new and bigger? Has this been happening like since the Olympics when they stood up and did the Black Power? And that was like years and years ago. Why is this still?
But it was an interesting reaction then, all right? I was in high school when that happened. And some of you remember it was the Mexico City Olympics, 68, I think it was, 1968 Olympics. So think of what was going on in 1968, all right? Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King is assassinated. Bobby Kennedy is assassinated. There are riots that are taking place literally on the streets, race riots. You still have places that have drinking fountains and bathrooms for coloreds only and whites only. There is still, the SEC had just literally been integrated the year before. I did a documentary for CBS Sports talking about the integration for football of the SEC. It didn't happen until 1967. It was Kentucky that did it. Up until that time, there were no African American athletes in the SEC. So 1968 was a very turbulent time. And at the Olympics, and again, this was, the Olympics, initially the ideal was amateurism. For instance, the Olympics don't give a championship award to whatever nation wins the most medals. We do that as media. We're the ones that keep track. There is no tally that's done for the Olympics. It's supposed to be just individual competitions and the glory of individual competitions. So on the stand, after one of the sprints, the two Americans finished first and second, I believe, John Carlos and Tommy Smith. And on the stand, on the pedestals, as the national anthem was being played, they both raised a gloved black hand and bowed their heads. Right? Gestures that we see all the time now, in all sorts of arenas. You can't imagine. It's difficult for you all to imagine the discord that generated. There were people that wanted them arrested, wanted them deported. But it got the conversation going. Now, it was a conversation that was going anyway. And this comes back to what we had said about Colin Kaepernick. He's not the first guy to come up to realize, oh, by the way, we're having some race problems in this country. And oh, by the way, we're having some poverty problems in this country. Oh, really, Colin? We didn't know that until you decided not to stand. So, but he said, and in his defense, he said, look, I want to get people talking about it. But what happened in the Olympics was fairly earth-shattering. And it really set the stage for a lot more that took place in the end of those 60s and into the 70s. It was an odd time to live. You all know about the history of the University of Mississippi and what went on here in 1962. When James Meredith tried to walk up the steps of the Lyceum. And if you've ever seen the photos of the riots that took place here, it was frightening. People died. It's interesting, just as an aside real quick about James Meredith. So the second novel I wrote, I actually set in Oxford. And I based it upon an old civil rights murder that took place in 1956 in the state of Mississippi, where Reverend George Lee was on his way, African-American reverend, on his way back from a voting rights rally. And the next morning he's found slumped over the wheel of his car. He's been shotgunned to death. And the sheriff at the time looked at it and said, nah, it's a motor vehicle accident. We don't have to investigate anything. Wrote it off completely. And when Reverend Lee's family said he's been shotgunned, the sheriff said, nah, those pellets, that must be fillings from his teeth from the motor vehicle accident. Never investigated. That was it. That was 1956. Yeah. So the story that I tell, I said in 1960, I use a similar situation, and then I jump to the present. In Oxford, Mississippi. And my main characters are a guy who's a law school professor whose father was a great civil rights crusader, and a woman who's a reporter for the New York Times whose grandfather was a KKK leader. And they sort of come together. This old cold case starts to unravel, and it kind of brings the two of them together, and they chase it down. And the idea for me was, I'd spent a lot of time here in lecturing, and I thought, what would the Mississippi I know, how would they deal with the ghosts of their past? And so I was down one time and doing some research, and I scheduled it around a football game, as I always do. And I'm back behind the Lyceum where they have the James Meredith Memorial, and I'm jotting down some of the things that are there. And one of the interesting comments, one of the quotes engraved, was from Merle Evers, Medgar Evers' wife. You know who Medgar Evers was? Medgar Evers was assassinated in the early 60s. He was a civil rights leader here in the state of Mississippi. He was gunned down in his own driveway by a guy by the name of Byron de la Beckwith. Byron de la Beckwith actually left his rifle at the site. They took prints off his rifle. They knew it was his. He boasted to people of the fact that he shot down Medgar Evers, and they went to trial, and the jury said, that's just not enough evidence to convict him. That was the old Mississippi. He was subsequently, years later, decades later, was convicted, died in prison for it. But Myrlie Evers' quote on the back there says, yes, Mississippi was, but now Mississippi is. And we're proud of what we have become. Talk about the changes. So the James Meredith story is, so I'm here and I'm doing some research, and somebody, an Ole Miss official, comes out and says, Mr. Ford, would you like to meet James Meredith? And I said, absolutely. Where is he? And he says, he's on the steps of the Lyceum. He's here. He just did an interview. And I told him you were here. He apparently had watched the O.J. Simpson trial and recognized you from there and said, I'd love to talk with him. So I come around the steps of the Lyceum, and he's on the steps, and I can see he's just finishing up a conversation. And a lot of students, Ole Miss students, and white and black, are sort of working their way towards James Meredith, and they're taking pictures of him. And he and I start to talk, and they're all getting close. And I said to the group, would you all like to have your picture taken with James Meredith? And so I'm handed like a dozen cameras, the phones at the time, so I'm taking everybody's picture. And he was trying to talk to all of them, and they walk away, and I said to him, in 1962, you were on these same steps, and people were trying to kill you, literally trying to kill you. Would you ever have imagined that you would come back here, and this would be the reception that you would get? From primarily white students. And it's interesting, he said, you know what, back then I was just trying to survive. He said, but I look at what has changed here, and I realize that things have changed in terms of our society. And those quote by Myrlie Evers. Yes, it was, but now it is. So we sort of an aside that has nothing to do with our conversation, but I thought it was interesting. So hopefully you thought it was kind of interesting. One more thing I want to talk about. We have a couple of minutes still. And that is how, coming back to the media, the intersection of the media and sports, and how the media frames the conversations, and how damaging it can be. And this is for you as aspiring journalists, right? Because you look at what the media can do to create the narrative and drive the narrative, and how difficult it is to change the narrative afterwards. Any of you familiar with the Duke lacrosse case? You know what we're talking about? Okay. Real quickly for those that are not. 10 years ago, a case came out of Duke. Their lacrosse team, they was in the midst of their spring break, and they were staying on campus because they had some games to play. And somebody, actually two of their captains, if you can imagine this, had the brilliant idea to have a party on their off-campus home and to get a whole lot of beer and to invite strippers. Right? These are the captains, unfortunately. So they do that. At the end of the night, a woman, African-American woman, is found slumped over in her car at a convenience store, barely attired. And the convenience store called the police. When the police come, they say the woman is sort of unresponsive, and they finally bring her to headquarters and they started to talk. And she alleges that she had been raped by at least 3 members of the Duke lacrosse team. Right. Now, if you've ever been down there, they're not great town-gown relationships between the city of Durham and Duke University. But so the police start to act on this. It gets in the hands of a prosecutor who I'll get to the end of what happens to the prosecutor. But essentially, they jump all over this as a case. And you can imagine the word gets out that this is going on to the media. So the media now looks at, again, not monolithic, but there were an awful lot of people who did unresponsible reporting and immediately concluded, first of all, this is a case that's going to generate interest. Why? Because it involves rich, white, entitled athletes who, according to the police, sexually assaulted an African-American woman who was a dancer. So if you think about it, this has all the elements of a sensational story to it. And the media was all over this story. And you got things such as people coming on within days going on television saying, you know what, the entire team should be thrown off campus. They should all be expelled. And the 3 guys who were involved in this, they should all, one person actually was a lawyer on TV, actually said, what do they need lawyers for? You know, they should just plead guilty and go to prison and do their time for what they did. And this was the drumbeat. There's only one problem. It never happened. And what happened subsequently is that it took almost a year. The prosecutor who took over this case originally had been a career prosecutor. And when it was assigned to him, all the lawyers involved were actually pleased, saying, this is a guy we've known, he's been reasonable, he's a career guy, he understands the system. Well, what changed is that in the interim, he was elevated to the chief prosecutor, because the chief prosecutor left to take a judgeship, and now he had to run for election to keep his job. And that raises issues, and these are some issues maybe as journalists you could look into at some point in time. Should we be electing our judges and prosecutors? Does that by electing them, do we simply put them in a position where they're going to respond and be buffeted by the winds of public opinion? So here you have a guy who was thought to be a reasonable, respectable prosecutor, and now he's got to run for office. He's in his 50s. He's got a mortgage. He's got kids in college. He can't lose his job. And he becomes completely irrational. One of the 3 men who's been charged has proof that he was not there at the time. Right? He has video of him at the time that this was supposed to take place, video of him at an ATM machine. He has receipts showing he called a cab from the party. You know, a couple of the guys left the party. They were like, okay, you know what, I don't really want to stay for the strippers, so I'm going to leave. This guy is one of them. He leaves. The receipts from the taxi that picks him up, takes him to an ATM machine, video of him taking money out, goes to a McDonald's, video of him getting something to eat, and he goes back to his dorm, and the card swipe shows that he goes into his dorm. All of this makes it physically impossible for him to be there. The prosecutor refuses to even look at the evidence. Why? Because now this had become an enormous story. You know, all of those elements they talked about that made this a sensational, salacious case is driving this story. And ultimately, fast forwarding, what happens is ultimately after a year, the Attorney General of the state of North Carolina realizes that this thing is out of control because more and more evidence is now starting to show up that it didn't happen. And ultimately, the Attorney General steps in, takes over the investigation, and does a press conference you rarely see where he stands up and he says, not only are these guys not guilty, they are absolutely, completely innocent. It never happened. It turned out the woman, sadly, had serious emotional disturbances, had serious problems with drug abuse. Indeed, she is in prison now after she killed her boyfriend, stabbed him to death once before she tried to kill him by setting him on fire. It never happened, and yet the media took this story and ran with it to the point that I interviewed one of the young men, and he said, I said to him, yeah, you've been exonerated. He said, sure, except for the fact that when I die, what do you think the first line of my obituary is going to be? One of the Duke University lacrosse players. So it's an illustration of how the media jumped on a story and were so quick to say this is going to generate eyeballs, it's going to generate clicks, it's going to generate viewers, all the things that are important for us to make money. You know, the fact that we happen to be wrong, well, that's too bad. So it's an illustration of how cautious you need to be when you get what you think is the big story that comes across your desk or your computer, or you talk to somebody about it. You know, just remember that everything, that real journalism is driven by the facts, and you can do extraordinary damage in your profession if you don't do that. I think we have any other questions, any things we can get to before we get you guys out of here? Because I know you have places to do. I thought usually somebody puts their hand up and says, so what do you think, Jack? Did OJ do it? Right? I figured somebody had to come out with that one. And the prediction for Saturday is I haven't seen them lose in years. I don't intend to see them lose on Saturday. Thanks, guys.